Hey, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of Indie Game Movement, the podcast that talks about the marketing and business of indie games. I'm Andrew Pappas. I'm going to be your host today, and we're going to be talking about crafting your career value in a competitive games market. So, with the gaming industry experiencing significant job cuts over the past several months, developers and professionals are finding it increasingly difficult to secure new opportunities, making articulating your value more critical than ever. So, in this episode, we're going to discuss how to communicate your worth effectively in such a competitive environment, from strategies that craft compelling narratives that stand out to navigating career transitions. We'll get to the bottom of how you can stand out and better navigate the uncertainties that lie ahead. So that's what we're going to be talking about right here today on Indie Game Movement. Hey, everybody, and we're back. And today I have with us Jean Leggett. Jean, how is it going? It is so great to have you on the show today.
Andrew, it's going really well. I've had a really nice summer and things are starting to heat up as we go into September. So I'm pumped.
I absolutely love that attitude. Pun intended, folks, or at least I'm going to say that it was. But but before we get too off the rails here, that'd be me, because again, I'm pumped up with the summer and everything else. Jean here is a career joy strategist and career coach at Jean Leggett Consulting Inc. Please, actually tell us briefly a little bit. What is this career joy strategist? What's a career coach?
I occasionally get people asking me that, and it's because I don't want to be confused with somebody that just writes resumes. I've been coaching for 16 years next month. I've had almost 1,000 clients over, that period of time. And most of them have been in the last 5 years. And the career joy element comes from, I really believe that if we can dial into what is meaningful and in alignment, that we will connect with what is joyful. And I don't think that we are meant to work until we drop. I think we are meant to live, and work is meant to fund our lives. So let's find some joy in there. And that's what I do. I help people really hone in on their secret sauce and a more meaningful life.
I absolutely love hearing that, because I think all of us listening here, that's something we can all totally get in line with. We, feel that the industry needs more of that. And plus, individually, we need more of that. It shouldn't just be a churn, a burnout, all these other things, and to really focus on yourself, because by doing that, you're also going to be helping out others in the process. Like if you're in an environment where you thrive, it's going to be so much better. And also it's we're not getting there yet, but yes, that's going to be what we're talking about today, folks. But in addition to what Jean does, she's also been the co-founder of game studios and CEO as well. You mentored and sponsored girls in video game camps. I mean, you've also been I know I'm going to jump around here a little bit, folks, but there's just so much. You've been a coach since 2008. As part of founding that studio, you raised like $500,000.
Yeah.
That's impressive, and something that,
and that was in 2014.
Wow.
When you think about it, right?
Yeah. It's a while ago, but not it's some.
2014, the landscape of games was very different, and it wasn't, I think the first wave of indie wow had passed, but we were in a sort of like a podunk town about an hour north of Toronto. No disrespect to Barrie, but it's just not where you would have a thriving arts or technology community. And yeah, we did friends and family. We raised a bunch of money and we pursued our dreams. We learned a lot. There were a lot of ups. There were a lot of downs. And I documented some of that. We talked about it being on my podcast. But it's been such an adventure, to be able to have made all of these connections online and built a community in games. I've spoken around the world about our studio and our experience. I've done a lot of stuff. I've done like a TEDx talk about teaching kids how to code using our game engine. So yeah, it's like we've done a lot in those 10 years. It's bonkers.
Yeah, absolutely, and some of that includes some titles. I believe one of which won the Game of the Year in Canada. That was Daniel's Inferno, and speaking of other things, I mean, you have some like awards it received, like the IGDA Next Generation Leader, among a few others, like Girls Make Games, GDC Scholar. I mean, so many there, and also I think this is really cool. You're part of the New Zealand Center of Digital Excellence for that's been what, 3 years now?
Yeah, 3 years I've been mentoring folks, and I work with people who are either successful or unsuccessful grant applicants, and I'm helping them. Like, it's so funny because as a career coach, most of my work is focused on helping people better articulate what their value and their story is for their resumes. That's a big part of what I do. But what coaching really is about asking questions, getting the clients to feel resonance. So, like, it's either going to be a yes or it's going to be a no, whichever gets you closer to the answer. And so my job as I'm doing this mentorship for game devs in New Zealand is just asking them questions and also letting go of my assumptions, because somebody will say, I've been running my business for a few years. And then when you ask them a question, they're like, oh, I've never considered that before. So all of the things that I've learned and success or failures that I've had get to help out that next generation.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And you've been doing these things in other capacities too, such as, like you mentioned earlier, a TED Talk. You've spoken at GDC, Grace Hopper, some IGADA events like the Leadership Summit, and also you have that podcast that you mentioned, which is, and I love this title, Games, Grit, and Gratitude. Such a good thing. And folks, we'll be sure to include that in the show notes as well, too, because there's a lot of great content. Clearly, you're listening to podcasts, so you should definitely check that one out, too. As like lots of valuable resources there, especially as as it would relate probably to our conversation today. So,
yes, there are. I want to just point out with the Games, Grit, and Gratitude podcast, there are actual worksheets that you can do for about half of the episodes that help you work through what your like personal value statements are, what your value statements are for your indie game studio, who's your target audience. Like, oftentimes, and this is what I love about games, is you have all these creative people that have an idea that they want to come to life. But as you and I both know, Andrew, what will make us more successful is if we start with an end goal in mind, and it's either going to be games as art or games as business, games as product. And so games as business, games as product is something that I did not have the insight to start with back in 2014. And I think that if we had, approached our studio from, hey, this thing has to be sustainable within a certain amount of years, I think things would have turned out a lot differently, because you make decisions and actions based on that. So if you want a good listen, I hear I'm charming, and those worksheets have helped a lot of people. So have at it.
Yeah, love it. And I'm trying to think of ways to properly articulate this, but there's a recent guest I had on the show that was talking about the same stuff, but just with publishers and articulating things there. So I got to find a way to link these two episodes together somehow, because I think they're just kind of a 1-2 punch, so to speak, in terms of everything you just said and more. But that's besides the point. We're here today to talk about some really cool stuff, specifically, crafting your career value. But before we do that, we got to have you go through the Q box round, Gene. So what that is, folks, for those of you who aren't familiar, it's just a few random questions that we prepared here for Gene to get to know her a little bit more. So, Gene, are you ready for the Q box round?
Go for it.
All right. First, what's the most helpful or impactful advice that you received?
Okay, there's two. So I have to cheat. There's two.
That's fine.
One is you can put salt in your coffee either before you brew it or after you brew it, and it will be less bitter. Trust me on that. A little dash of salt. Okay. It's lifelong advice. If you're in a diner, coffee is horrible. You've got it. So the other thing is, like, the biggest piece of advice is it is a waste of time trying to convince people who are determined to misunderstand you. Um, I have a very strong reason for saying that, but just be yourself and try to be a better person today than you were yesterday, period.
Yeah, I like that one too. And I've dealt with situations like that before in work environments where I saw some person one way, another colleague of mine saw them in another, and I was trying to convince them otherwise, and they just weren't having it. So
Yeah.
I managed it accordingly, but it's tough. And the realization you may come to is it may never change, and you can only control what you do have control over. And accepting that is sometimes hard, but very valuable. So agree with you on that. Next is name one thing that motivates you every day.
All right. I know this is going to sound super cheesy, but I see the work that I do as having like a legacy ripple effect. I've like 800 plus clients over the last 4.5 years, 5 years. I have literally seen people's incomes sometimes double or quadruple after we've done our work. And I just like, I see them then be able to pay off their student loans. I see them buy their first house with their spouse. And or in many instances, I work with I do a lot of pro bono work as well. And I'm seeing people who come from historically excluded communities, they are changing their financial income, and that just, it changes their futures. And I just think about like how their children and their grandchildren and their nieces and nephews and nibblings and all of those, like it, yeah, it's so freaking cool.
Yeah.
So
And
that turns my crank every day.
and yeah, because it even extends beyond that. Like, how are they now influencing changes in around them,
Yes.
whether it's work, whether
Yes.
it's their communities? So yeah, I could see. I mean, I don't know. I'm
It's
getting motivated.
addictive.
Yeah.
Honestly, it's totally, totally addictive.
Awesome. All right. Last but not least, and the staple here on the show is what game are you playing now?
I feel like like some people are going to listen and they're going to be judgy, and you can judge all you want. But at the end of the day, I don't want to be anywhere near my computer or a screen, or at least close anyways. So I have been playing a little game on my phone. It's a Sudoku based game, but I play a lot of competitive Sudoku. So a long, long time ago, like 20, 25, 30 years ago, I played online Clue. I was very competitive. I was a world champion for a long time. And so, yeah, anything that's got a competition but is more puzzle based, that's me.
And hey, there's nothing wrong about that because you're not the first person to say that, and you won't be the last in terms of some nice casual or maybe not semi-casual, let's say casual competitive aspects with because let's face it, we're on our screen so much. Having a
Oh my
different type of
God.
thing going
Yeah.
on is good.
I'm just going to make a little confession. Like, and I don't think it's a confession if anybody follows me on Threads, which is where I'm most active right now. I am a board game girl. Like,
Yes,
I
you are.
have board game nights at least twice a month at my house with a bunch of friends. I love that face to face component, and I still love play and I love all of that. But online stuff, no, I'm on the computer too much. Get me off here.
Yeah, no, good, great point. And yeah, you're right. Board games, and it's amazing to see how well they continue to do and thrive and grow because it just means there's more interactions going on. So
Ugh, I
absolutely love
have, I
it.
have like 400 games or something like that. It's bonkers.
Well, yeah, that's absolutely awesome. Love that you really, got into detail, shared some of those things a little bit with us, especially with all the games and stuff. Because, like I said just a moment ago, we got to all unwind a little bit sometimes. So, but when we're not unwinding, we're talking about really cool stuff like our discussion today, which again, to remind you folks, is about crafting your career value, especially in a competitive games market. Because let's face it, that's the case. It's competitive. Regardless if you're looking for a career, making games, we're always going to be facing that. So to kind of kick things off here today, Gene, I mean, look, you've helped many professionals in the gaming industry, really articulate their value. So with that said, what are some of the common challenges people face when they're trying to express their worth, especially in this competitive field?
I think the thing that I have consistently seen time and time again is that people assume that others are mind readers. So what happens is people will look at a job posting and they'll go, I can do that. Like, that's great. And they have failed to communicate that they can actually do that on their resume. So they don't have an awareness of what the key marketable skills are. They don't quite understand how that lines up. So I have what I say to my clients is that a job posting is an expression of pain. Your job, hoo-wah. So it's I heard, understood, and acknowledge your pain. Right? That's what hoo-wah apparently stands for. Heard, understood, acknowledged. So like hoo-wah, I understand your pain. Let me speak to how I can alleviate your suffering. So that's one. Two is the lack of ability to sufficiently and succinctly communicate their previous experience. So one, they don't understand what needs to be said. And two, they lack the verbiage or the ability to be able to say, hey, I have done this thing. And then lastly, this, I could go on for just like half an hour on this topic completely, but they don't know what they've done is particularly special or important. Because when you do good things, sometimes you forget about them. You don't have an understanding of why it's relevant to somebody else's needs, or you literally have just forgotten that you're amazing.
Yeah. And these are all important aspects to consider because it's really kind of a weird contradiction in a way, right? Because we're approaching these things as like, oh, it's about me. I need to showcase my value. But yet there's two things happening. We need to showcase the value in one way, but then we need to showcase the value about ourselves, like to the prospective employer, but then we need to communicate our value in another way. And somehow, I think a lot of people get stumbled and then it comes off very differently.
Think about it this way. I mean, I hear about like people who use Instacart shoppers. So if you send somebody for like apples and bananas and they came back with a red rubber ball and a tube of toothpaste, you'd be like, what? That's not what I asked for. It's super interesting choices, but not what I asked for. So like literally, they're giving you a shopping list. They're saying, hey, we need these skills. You need to reflect back to them, hey, I have these skills. And that doesn't mean copy and paste what they have on their job posting verbatim, but to say, like, so for example, with narrative, sometimes people will just put a list of titles that they have worked on, whether they're indie or not. So that's great. Titles are nice, but titles don't tell me what you actually did on a project. Did you write the narrative? Did you do the barks? Did you do the narrative beat chart? Were you doing character descriptions, environmental writing? Like, you haven't told me anything about the day-to-day actual work. And so you could have been the coffee maker. You could have been the community manager. You could have been the programmer. Like, I don't know what you did. And so like, that's the first thing. Yeah. That's the first thing. It's, gosh, that just, I'll share with people some tips on how they can work that through.
Yeah. Well, I really like the direction you're going here. And I'm, curious to kind of like define this a little bit further, especially as it relates to, communicating value. So like, what would you say then, as it relates to what you were just saying, like, what are some key elements, that let's say either game developers or even professionals, often overlook when trying to define their value and maybe some of these other things you were just mentioning about?
Well, and I just want to backtrack for one moment, because I know the work that you do, Andrew, is really, it's based on helping people understand their target client, right? Like marketing is about what is your client's pain? What is your customer's pain? How can you solve a problem for them?
Yep.
If you start to look at job postings as an expression of pain, and our job is to alleviate their suffering, I just want people to think about it. That is your target customer. What does your target customer need? Solve for X. That's what it is. So coming back to the key elements of overlooking their value, I mean, having done this with 800 plus people in the last 5 years, I'm in a very unique position to be able to help people be benchmarked. So that's a big thing. People aren't sitting around, like all the people who have 5 years of experience as producers or, game designers or whatever. They're not sitting down and going, hey, can I compare my experience to yours? They do, but it's in a very informal, hey, let's complain about our work sometimes, at GDC. But what I'm saying is, like, professionally, people don't have a sense of how to benchmark themselves. And that is a particular insight that I have because I've done this with so many people for so long. But when you're where you land, so if you do a search on the GDC Vault online, if you have a full access pass, you can see a talk that I gave last year. But my PowerPoints are freely available on the GDC Vault. And I'm pretty sure that one of the slides on there is this matrix of showing you where are you in your career. So the idea that when you're at the entry level, you basically just have the foundational understanding of some things. So you have an awareness of things that you don't know and how you're meant to grow. As a side note, if you want to Google conscious competency model, it's a really impactful tool. So the idea that you don't know what you don't know, and then you start to know what you don't know, then you start to build on that. You learn, you master, and then you get to the place where you forget all the things that you know. So, it really is understanding where do you fit in with relation to others. And I often see women, especially, and historically excluded and overlooked people, they feel uncomfortable defining what their value is because they have often been cast aside, put down, or have faced additional challenges in the workplace. Consistently hear this, especially from my women of color clients. So like when you're asking somebody to define their value, it's not just the work that they've done, but it's also their belief in themselves. And so sometimes there's some work to be done there too. So I like to say that a resume is just a reflection of your work, but you also have to do a lot of inner development work to like really own the things that you've done.
Yeah. And I think that's a good point to make too, because, regardless of your, where you come from, your positioning and everything else. And if there's been obstacles that you've been trying to overcome, because everybody's obstacle is going to be different, but they can put you in a position, and some greater than others, where it's knocking you down, and therefore you're not going to come out and come forward. So being aware of these things, I think it puts a lot of people in a better position to be like, okay, I can acknowledge this, but let's not let it hold me back, because if it does, it could be a pattern that continues that you feel like you don't have control over. But what it sounds like is you still have control over it, but you have to maybe address it to a degree. To some level.
Yeah. The biggest thing that I would say, like, it's super interesting. I find that I get clusters of clients with certain themes. And last month's cluster of clients were just like a lot of conversations around complex PTSD. So for those of you listening, complex PTSD is basically a repeated exposure to traumatic experiences. For a lot of us, that comes from our childhood. So I have undiagnosed, so it hasn't been like officially diagnosed, unofficially diagnosed complex PTSD. And that impacts how people feel comfortable talking about how they have owned something. Or they might go into a work environment and they might be overwhelmed and they don't feel psychologically safe to ask a question. So they might flounder in their roles because of their past trauma. So not that the coach work that I do is therapy, but it is often therapeutic, because sometimes we're able to dig in just a little bit there. And I've also seen, I've seen clients try to use AI to rate their resumes, which feels like a flat, less like personality, less type resume. I've also seen clients for whom we've done the work, Their resume is like shiny, beautiful. It is like they're them on their very, very best day, but they haven't arrived to the place where they can fully embody it.
Mm.
So you can write something that is a reflection of your brilliance, but if you're not in the headspace to accept this is the truth of what you have to offer, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. So it's a 1-2 punch, right? It's
Yeah.
like you need to really feel that ownership and that embodiment of what your career stories are.
Yeah. And I like that too, because I think a lot of times we may, in some ways, it might not feel this way, but we may oversimplify this process. But I mean, you're putting yourself, you are an individual that's going to be contributing to in this workforce and in this company and everything else. So if that's not, if you're only meeting halfway, I'm sure that can be articulated or communicated as such, and then therefore making it more of a challenge to move forward. So
Yeah.
I love this because sometimes it's like we look at things that are so simple, but yet they can be complex, but they don't have to be. But it's just a matter of understanding that level before you can kind of level up yourself and get to these.
100%. That's why when I see somebody say, you just need action verbs, I'm like, no, you don't just need action verbs. Stop with that lie. Because the action verbs, yeah, there's a little bit of gatekeeping around resume language. But honestly, I had a client yesterday who has been a games producer for 6+ years and has been in games for almost 10. And I was like, listen, you've got some strategy and execution. And they were like, no, no, no. I've been told that I'm not very strategic. And I showed them examples from other client resumes where they were talking about strategy and execution. And they're like, I've done this. I'm like, I know you have. But it was the way that they were looking at themselves. So yeah, there's so much impact that you can have when you just do a reframe. And when I say just, I mean, I've been doing this for a long time. So I'm pretty good at helping people rewire their brains.
Yeah, and what you just talked about is what you mentioned earlier. And folks, it's all comes down to approach. How you approach someone, how you approach your audience. And in this case, the audience would be your prospective employer, let's say. How you approach them and how you position yourself is going to make all the difference. So it's just funny how these things kind of like, all come together. Now, speaking of come together, I know, especially now with the current landscape, I mean, there's a lot of like craziness going on because of how competitive things are. I mean, let's face it, there's ongoing layoffs, job cuts, everything. Just 2024 has been a little bit crazy. So in terms of like navigating, let's say, career transitions or even growth, I mean, I know this is a kind of a big area for people, but for, let's say, here's one for those who are looking to transition, let's say within the gaming industry, they're already there, but looking to maybe do something different, whatever they're looking to do. How can they best like articulate their evolving value, especially in this time? Like, is transition advised? Like, I know there's lots of word going out about these
Mm.
moves or stuff, but what are things let's say people do to better position themselves if they're looking to transition or, make the most out of this crazy market?
Well, there's a couple of things there. One, I just want to acknowledge that we don't collectively talk a lot enough about grief and loss of identity. One thing that I've seen is there's complex stuff happening right now. So we've seen almost 20% or more of our industry be like eliminated in the last, I'd say, year and a half, 2 years, which is really staggering and sad. But I do believe good things will come from it in the end. But it's going to be really hard, and it's been really rough on people. So, and so much of how we see ourselves is tied to our work. And I feel like that's a GDC talk that I might end up submitting later today. So who knows? Maybe you'll see me give that one in March, which is all about grief and loss and sense of identity. The other piece of it, Andrew, is what makes me a little bit quirky, different, amazing is that, there are chronological resumes, which is the standard. It's the way that we've been doing resumes since resumes were a thing before you went out and worked for 40 years in a shoe factory, right? So chronological resumes. And there's something called like a functional resume, which I didn't even know had a name. I just thought, why are we telling resumes? Why are we telling these stories chronologically? Like, what happens if we just dial in on pain? So that's what I've been doing for the last 4.5 years, and to a significant degree of success. Has it worked for every single client? It has not worked for every single client. Has it worked for the majority of clients? Heck yeah, it has. Because what it is it's focused on, it's dialed into your area of expertise. So I want you to like picture your work experience, right? So say let's use the example of a game designer. What is the first thing of experience that I need to know about you? What have you designed? Okay, break it down. What does that look like? Oh, it's core game loops. It is game progression. It is like missions and quests. Like, tell me specifically what you have designed. Because what often happens, like I saw this on a resume the other day, they're like, I wrote grant applications and the game had like X thousand downloads. I'm like, that's nice, but what did you design? Like, what did you write? So understanding that you have a key pain point that you're trying to address. For narrative, it's narrative. For marketing, it's marketing. Then that second band of experience, or that second pillar of experience, as I call it, it's like the integration pillar. So it's valid experience, V, integration, I. So that's your technical skills. So if you're a producer, production is going to be your first pillar. What have you produced? What does that look like? What are the key pains that you're addressing? Integration, maybe you're talking about Jira, maybe you're talking about organizing playtests. And then the last piece is people skills. So what is your communication, collaboration, documentation, like anything to do with like rallying the troops? So it's about taking out your experience and then organizing it into non-transphobic sorting hats. All right. So that tells you a lot about how I think about the world right there. And so, you were asking me about transitioning. Here's a couple of things. One, I am inclined to lean towards safety, stability, and dignity. So if what you need is to go work at a grocery store because you need to make your bills, there's no shame in that. Two, in this competitive job market, people with less than 5 years are getting the short end of the stick. People over the age of 40 are getting the short end of the stick. It's an ugly market all around. I have watched people transition from the more highly competitive spaces in games, so design roles, writing roles, into production. Why? Well, production is a pretty cool track, first of all, but more so because there are just more producer roles than there are game designer roles. There might only be one writer, but there might be multiple producers because you have a large team. There's so many more opportunities out there. So do you want to approach this from hey, I want to hedge all of my bets? Or do you want to say, I'm going to continue, I won't take any jobs unless it is the writing job of my dreams? Listen, folks, here's the truth of it. We're technically not in a recession, but our industry is, and our industry is suffering. There is the job you want versus the job you need because you need to pay the bills. And that's just the ugly truth of it right now. It's like sometimes we have to make compromises. And if you ask anybody that's in their 40s, 50s, 60s, there have been times where the economy was not kind to us, and we just have to like stiff upper lip and get through it.
Yeah. It's really funny. Well, very different context. I had a very similar conversation with my wife, basically just saying, hey, look, I'm not in this position, but if it ever came to it and I had to go down the street and work at the grocery store, I'd do it. And then I'd one up from there and one up from there, because that's what I would just know that would need to be done. And for you saying it's cool, but I think there's a lot of cool things here because one, I mean, it's really painting this perspective of reality that we're all faced with right now, right? And it affects everybody. It's a trickle down effect. It goes across the board in various capacities in terms of what can or can't be done because of these limitations, because of this competitive market. But when you were saying this, like some of the strategies you just mentioned about, articulating your values in like a really, or your experience in a very almost narrative way, and or a way that stands out. And then what you said earlier about like really understanding your values. How do you articulate those values? How do you articulate the pain points or address those pain points for these people? It's still going to be rough. But if you have those components, that understanding and that different mindset in terms of how you approach this, I would say more likely than not, you're just going to be a little bit of a better position maybe to the
Yeah.
person next to you.
And I really need to just emphasize for people, sometimes it's literally just luck.
Yeah.
I had a client who was a highly technical client who had not worked in their field for 2 years. They were burned out and gaslit by their former employer. They took a very atypical break from their career and did something very artistic. And then they said, yeah, I'd like to be back to making the money that I used to make. And I was like, okay, I've never worked with your type of client before, like in their field. I'm pretty sure this will work because it's been, again, it's just about like dialing to pain. What is the pain of your future employer and how does your experience line up to that? Bam, this guy had a job within like 5 weeks. And I was like, sweet. But the same process and experience might be a little bit different in a field that has significantly more competitors.
Mm.
And so it's about weighing your expectations and also ask yourself, is this entitlement that I'm feeling? Is this fear I'm feeling? There's so much more to this. There's like a very deep emotional perspective to all of this. And again, this is why it drives me crazy when people are like, just put action verbs. It's like, it's not about that. We exist as human beings with feelings. And so it's a lot more complex than that. It's, yeah. But I have snuck ahead. I know some of your other questions. I'm chomping at the bit to answer them.
No, it's fine. And I know, cause as these things go with podcasts, we do have time limits, but I mean, that last point too, that you said about, geez, I'm drawing a quick blank, but in terms of like, really identifying with, geez, I'm losing my train of thought, but yeah, no, it's okay.
Yeah, we were talking about like entitlement and
Yes,
also the
thank you.
emotional impact. Yeah.
Self-evaluation. Because I think that sometimes it's hard because it can be very subjective.
Yeah.
But there's probably, and I know there's ways to look at these things objectively, and sometimes we don't want to, right? We're faced with this truth that might be like, okay, we got to change how we think maybe, but
this is the thing. Like I can think of just a handful of consultation calls that I've done, right? I do these little 15-minute, they're zero obligation. You might get you get a gentle sales pitch at the end, but it doesn't matter to me if people hire me. I really want to help them in those 15 minutes. And I've had to have some very hard to hear conversations with people. And like, so for example, somebody was an art director at a graphic clothing company. And he's like, I keep applying for art director roles in video game companies. I'm not getting any callbacks. I'm like, that's because an art director at this type of company is not the same as an art director at this company. And I looked at their portfolio and I said, he's like, can I be an artist for a games company? And I looked at his portfolio and I'm like, listen, I'm not an artist. But I can tell you, here's a bunch of other artists. I would encourage you to go look at their portfolios, because what I need you to understand is you're competing with some of the best people in the world. You don't have to be the best, but you do have to be willing to be committed to the craft of being the best. And that's where I feel like you have generations of children who have grown up and they're like, oh my God, I love games. And that's how they end up in games, right? Like they have made games such a big part of their cultural appetite. Then they decide they want to pursue making games, and they'll go and they'll get these very expensive degrees. Many of them will come out. Listen, 80% of those students were in the bottom 80% of their class. That's just how math works, folks. So the 20% who did really well, maybe they've networked really well. Maybe they come from a place of privilege. There's lots of reasons why they may have succeeded. But a lot of people aren't going to get jobs and they're going to be upset about it. And this is the thing, nothing is guaranteed to you in life. The number of times I've pivoted, listen, I started off as an admin assistant, became an office manager, stand up comic, coach, startup founder, and now I'm doing this. And it's this, the through line in all of this is I'm really great at listening to people and helping them dial in. But you get better as things go. I'm 47. I have earned these stripes. You can't expect that the world is going to be in your favor at 22 and 28 or 32. Like we are works in progress.
Yeah. And we will continue to be. And I love that you ended with that, because I think once you start looking at things that way, I at least from my perspective, things become a lot more clear than they did. And it's these beliefs, it's these feelings that sometimes will kind of cloud that vision a little bit. But then when you look at things this one way, and I know it might sound like fluff, folks, but really that whole process can really reveal a lot of clarity. And at least in my on my journey, that's what I'm noticing. The more clarity I have, the more direction, the more focus, the more momentum things.
Yeah.
And I know I'm relating to other things than necessarily job searches and such, but I see that in all areas and aspects of my life. And anyways, that's why I love that you said that, because I think
I've heard these little snippets over the years. I had a coach that said clarity equals cash. I was like, oh, I don't like the sound of that. But then I realized what she was trying to say was clarity equals buy-in. Clarity equals commitment of understanding. And when you don't have clarity, you have confusion. So the more clear that you can get either about yourself for yourself or about yourself for others, the easier you're going to be able to like nail the brief, as they say.
Yeah.
You had asked me, I think it was like about people transitioning. So I've had clients that have moved from like, how do they take their QA experience and then frame that from a perspective of production? I have a spreadsheet that has like over 400 sample resumes for my existing clients to work through. And I'd say we're coming close on at least 20 to 25% of those are producers. And I've worked with a lot of people that came from outside of games going, how do I get into games? I'm like, well, you don't have any writing skills or programming skills or art skills or music skills. But you have great organizational skills. So we're going to talk about you in the production perspective, right? Because it's like, you have to be realistic. What skills do you have that line up? Again, alignment. And I have seen, I had this one teacher, he was a band teacher, Matt Moore. He was like, listen, I want to be a games producer. I've been teaching for 10 years. I'm like, okay, well, how do you take teaching and sell it as production oriented? Well, I have a secret for you folks. The first rule is, what is the producery type stuff? What is the project management or project leadership component of teaching? If you turn curriculum and classroom management into a product and talk about it from that perspective, talk about size and scope of programs that you have developed, stakeholders that you have managed, processes and workflows that you have done, it's all there. It just needs to be framed in the perspective of a producer's pain. I've helped like military, I don't want to say he was an admiral, but he ran a ship, a battleship. And we took all of his experience and put it through the framework of what does a producer's pain? How can you solve production pain? Somebody who used to be fairly active on Twitter. I don't know if they aren't, because that to me, it's the bad place. So I don't go there anymore. But Javier Cardero, who is a dear friend of mine also, was really struggling at one point. And this would have been, I think, 3 years ago. And somebody said, hey, I'd like to do a GoFundMe for them because they're about to be evicted. They didn't have a job and they were really struggling. And I said, how about I just give you some time? We worked on a resume. Bam, we took the restaurant experience into production and talked about project management, size and scope, stakeholder relations. And I have watched her career go from, she landed a job within, I think, 3 weeks. The market was very different then. The market was very, very hot then. And she was known, but people struggled to see how she could solve their pain. Flip the narrative, landed the job. I think it paid something like 85,000. It was fully remote, beautiful working experience. Within a year, she had been headhunted by Meta, doubled her salary or close to it. So within like a year and a half, she went from zero, almost being homeless, to making a very handsome salary living in the city of her dreams. So here's the thing, it is literally about dialing into pain and finding alignment with your target audience who happens to be a hiring manager.
And I love those points there for two reasons. One, yes. and then two, alignment, pain points, understanding the audience. Folks, if anybody's questioning up until this point why we're talking about career development, well, it's simple because these are the same exact things that I have talked about on the podcast endlessly. These are the type of work that I do from a marketing perspective, but now you can see how they all interconnect, how they're all very important. And even if you are looking to hire people, how are these people aligning? How are they solving your pain point? And that might put you in a better position to then ask maybe better questions, or maybe questions that can dial in a little bit more to get what you're looking for. Because let's face it, if we're looking to hire for a position or stuff, or you're looking to apply, you don't want to be another pain point. And their pain point is trying to find someone else that can solve that pain for them. So the more we're in line with these things and all the work we do in whatever capacity, it just makes everything that much better. So sorry, that's my little quick spiel.
No, I love it. I love it. I have clients that come back roughly like 18 months to 2 years later, and they're like, great, I'm ready to move on. And I would love your help to take what I've learned in the last 2 years, and I want to up-level my resume. So I've done that a handful of times, and it's been a real joy. And one of them came back and he's like, Jean, clarity equals cash. And I'm like, dang it, I love it. I love it. It's been stuck in his head for 3 years. And it's like, that's the thing. But we don't understand that. It's a basic marketing principle, but it's also a basic communication principle.
Yep, absolutely.
People are not mind readers.
No, we can't assume, folks, because if we do, well, we know generally it doesn't work out as well as you like it to. All right. Well, we're coming on time here. Can't think enough. But before you do, one, what are some, we talked about a lot. I know we didn't talk about everything, but what are some, tips, suggestions, anything that you could recommend or, to our guests based off of what we did talk about or relates to? And then after that, let's get some links. But first,
yeah,
tips.
Absolutely. I think that people might want to start thinking about being proactive in your career. First of all, your resume should not be updated when you're only looking for work. It should be updated on a quarterly or twice a year or an annual basis. You should be tracking all of the great stuff that you've been doing because it disappears from your brain. So a thing that you can do is you can grab 5 to 10 job postings, even if you're not actively looking, and start to pull out the language. That's how I built 800 plus resumes over the last 5 years, is I didn't know what somebody did in this field, but if you look at enough job postings, you can see it. So do that. Be proactive about making your career path. The number of people I've told that I've spoken to that work for larger studios, they're like, yeah, we do career development, and then they don't. So maybe that's something that you need to do. Do a needs assessment, either by yourself or with somebody like me, where you're looking at the future jobs of the level that's up, and then map out the skill development that you need to do. So be proactive, because guess what? Nobody's just going to hand you your promotions and your career path. Like, that's super rare. This is something that we have to be constantly moving towards. One, build a healthy network. Don't be a shit talker. I have shit talked people in games. I really have. And I thought that it was okay to do because other people around me were doing the same thing. People were gossipy and I partaked in gossip. Don't. So especially if you're new, just keep your mouth shut. The shutter your mouther, the better. So highly recommend that. And I feel absolutely garbage about all the times that I shit talk people.
I'll add to that too, because in similar cases that's happened to me a long time ago. And then from those lessons, I'm like, just assume whatever you're saying to whoever, that those people that you're talking about will hear it too.
100%, Andrew. If you are, let's just put it this way, whatever you say, you might as well just put it on Twitter, because it will get back to people. It gets back to people. And what's worse is it will get twisted when it gets back to people. And there's no repairing that. No. So I've learned that the hard way. But, and then the last thing that I would say is it is competitive. You do not have to be the best, but you have to be willing to work on your craft. So whether you're an indie game dev or just like a random weirdo, and I love random weirdos, listening to this podcast, it is about the incremental growth. This is not, the number of people that they're like, I'm 28 and my life isn't figured out. I'm like, you know what? Welcome to the club. I was 42 before I had that giant aha moment where it was the culmination of all of my skills and dreams. Most of us are going to live to be 100. That's most of us. You've got a lot of life to live. So give yourself a lot of grace and space to grow and to be misunderstood. But with that clarity comes direction and purpose and some career joy.
Love it. So such great points. And now, how can people connect with you if they want to learn more, if they, need some guidance? Please drop us some links.
They can head over to jeanleggett.com, findcareerjoy.com. That sort of redirects to the same place. I'm super excited that my new website's going to be up at some point, sometime this year, with a lot of extra resources and worksheets, because not everybody can afford to work with me. And I don't advertise this a heck of a lot, but I do pro bono work. So I do about 10 to 20% per month of pro bono. But I'm also really open to having 15-minute conversations with people and just giving them some feedback on their resumes.
Awesome. So folks, take advantage of that. Like Jean said, she's got the site, jeanleggett.com. But you know what? You can go to the show notes too. It'll be there too. And link up if you think that it would be helpful. And I can attest that it definitely can be. So that said, Jean, thank you so much for being here and providing this insight, and not just giving us a perspective, but a real genuine perspective, because I think sometimes, really positioning yourselves a lot better and having a better understanding of things, it makes all the difference in how we can achieve what we're looking to do. So thank you for helping us with that and being here.
Thanks so much for having me. And, for those of you that might hear this, and some of you are going to feel really hopeful about what's next. Some of you might feel really discouraged. Everything changes. Nothing is permanent except death and taxes. And so stick around. You've got so much more growth to go in your life, and make sure that you find your people and find alignment, and know that seasons change and your life will too.
Hey everyone, thank you for listening to another episode of Indie Game Movement. I'm Andrew Pappas, your host, and the show's producer is Mustafa Price. Show notes for this episode can be found by visiting rengenmarketing.com, the number episode of the show. Rengen Marketing is a consulting marketing company that helps indie devs with their marketing efforts. Whether you need guidance with your game's marketing strategy or could use a free marketing plan template, then please visit www.rengenmarketing.com and take action. A special thanks to Dakota Saw for Season 2's opening theme and Melissa Gellis for the new logo design. And as always, thanks for being such great listeners, and we'll see you next time on Indie Game Movement.